Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. We appreciate you being here. My name is Tom Volek, and I'm with the School of Journalism. And this afternoon, we'll have a presentation and a little chat with Dr. DeAngela Burns-Wallace from the University of Missouri. And Dr. Burns, a great SEC institution, I might add. Hey, I will. Some of you know, some of you don't know. I graduated from over there, okay? So, and she is the Assistant Vice Provost for Undergraduate Studies at that esteemed institution, the University of Missouri. And today, Dr. Burns-Wallace is going to address us on the topic of what are the three biggest challenges to student academic success that public research universities face. And then we have asked her, you propose to engage academic units and academic support services in efforts to improve graduation rates. Dr. Burns-Wallace?
Thank you. Good afternoon. All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Moving a little and holding on to my notes, and probably about halfway through I'll set them down and just jump into it. I am so excited to be here today and to talk about the topics that I have been asked to speak on. And I say that because this work is so critical. This work is so fundamental to who we are as an institution. And because of that, my passion for this work, for me, is unmatched. And when I get a room of people who are willing to listen about student success, I'm all in. So that said, we're going to jump right in. When we received the prompts, I took a minute and really started to take apart the question and think about what are those three biggest challenges to student academic success that a public research institution faces. And it took me a minute to get to where I wanted to land on the answer. And I think it was because of how the question was stacked. Because when you read the question or think about the question, it really started to talk about, it really started to ask about kind of what, from an institutional perspective. And for me, when I think about success, what matters to student success, I always come at it from purely a student lens. Not purely, but fundamentally and first, a student lens. The model you have up here that's cutely populating itself is actually George Koo and Kinsey and a group of others' work, which is one of, for me, one of the stronger models that I have seen out there. And as a research institution, I always want to start with the research and the literature. It's a very busy picture, and you may not be able to see all of it, but what I want to point out in the big scheme of things is that this idea of what matters to student success, irrespective of where we are or who we are, fundamentally is about so many different things that you can't even read them all, right? There are factors that are the pre-college experiences of those students and what they bring to the table. There are factors that are within that college experience, both that are student behaviors and institutional conditions that have real impact on how that student progresses. There are external factors, federal policy, accountability, demographics, economic forces, state policy, funding, things of that nature that also have a real impact on what matters to student success. So at the core of this, you have any number of conditions that are affecting students and their success. What we find overall is that from a student perspective, there are three main areas that impact a student and their success, and particularly their departure, okay? Those are academic, financial, and social integration. Various data sources, depending on which ones you pull and which departure theory they are using, will say on average about 20 to 25% of your students who depart across higher education depart for academic reasons. Another 20 to 25% depart for financial reasons. The rest, about 50%, depart for social integration, match, fit, belonging, sense of self and identity reasons. That's where that student sits. But when we layer our institution, and particularly a public research institution, over it, you begin to see and paint the middle of the model that I just showed. Because student behavior is only one part of this. Institutional conditions are critical to what's going on with that student behavior and interact to really create the challenges or barriers that those students are facing. So in this, we start at the core of that with institutional culture. And what we find, if we were to distill it down to 3 major challenges, and that was a challenge, so you'll see as I talk about 3, I've compacted some into the 3. Had to get creative. But there's a reality that our complexity as a public research institution, the depth and breadth of what we offer in terms of our academic curriculum, in terms of the experiences, in terms of who we are as an institution and what we can offer our student, that complexity is a pure benefit to the student, but when we look through a student success lens, can sometimes become a challenge or a barrier because of the decentralized nature of some of our actions and our activities, the natures of how our policies and procedures are stacked in such a way that creates fictitious barriers for students to progress. That complexity brings a richness for what those students will get from the institution if they are successful, but it creates a real barrier for that student who is trying to navigate one of these 3 spaces to be successful. And at the core, their academic success, we would want to hope, is impacted solely by academic preparation and their ability to move through their major and how they do in their classes. But the reality is that our policies and procedures, our decentralized nature, that depth and breadth of opportunities for a student that doesn't know how to navigate can be just as crippling as failing a class. If we move into another area, let's go to understanding our students. The nature of students in higher ed, all the reports and data will tell you, is changing. The students look differently, they act differently, they move differently. But on our campuses, for the nature of who we are, and for the most part, our student still is largely that traditional age student, right? Who wants that brick and mortar experience, who wants to be in the dorms and be a part of the culture. But how they learn and how they are moving through higher education is different. Understanding how they swirl between on-campus offering, online offerings, and so many other opportunities, summer experiences, things that we are offering to them and telling them, this is what you need to take advantage of to really be successful in this environment and in your education. But understanding how they are engaging, understanding how they navigate, how in this age of technology they swirl through this and they think of it as one space, but we don't always. Understanding who that student is. Understanding, as we talked a little bit about, why they leave. But even more importantly, understanding who is successful. Why are they successful? And how do we pattern some of that in our work? Because, again, of that complexity coupled with that ever-changing student that in some ways still looks very traditional, but the way that they are engaging, the way that they are moving through our institution, and higher ed in general is different, leads to kind of the third piece of this, which is thinking about, as a public research institution, at our core, teaching and learning we know is important. But our research agenda is also important. And there is a reality in higher education with funding, with accountability issues, that sometimes those two issues actually are in conflict. Or maybe not in a conflict as much as a push and a pull, because our resources are not ever ending, right? So that work that we put in around teaching and learning, to be able to expand it, to make it go deeper, to make it have an impact on our students' success, how they are moving through, how they are engaging with the institution, how they are reaching those learning outcomes that we are developing, there has to be some cost to the resources, the time, the faculty, the curriculum, the things that we can do on one side versus the other, when also our research agenda is core to the mission of who we are. You put all three of those around an institutional culture of who we are as an institution, who we are within our state, who we are within our region, and what our brand promise says we will deliver to these students. And you find that so many of our students continue to fall out in these three areas. So something isn't aligning, right? So the second half of the question really pushed me to connect them. I don't know if we were supposed to, but that's how I thought about them. You think about what those challenges are, and then you begin to drill down and say, now how do we get the units, the academic support units, in a place where they can have real impact, right? In a place where they can change graduation rates. But for me, I would say not just graduation rates. I would challenge that we want them to change retention rates, persistence rates across time, that we want them to change time to degree, debt burden, that we want them to change any number of those data metrics, but we also want to strengthen the experience, the learning, those outcomes, how those are tied to how a student and a family in our communities see the return on investment for higher education. It goes beyond the numbers. But to get from that big picture, to get from what our students are facing to what's going on in the institutional conditions, to how we turn that into real action at the academic unit or the academic support areas sections, that's hard. I pulled this quote: if you don't know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing. And I say that because one of the big things in student success, when we start to pull the research, and across the board we see, I'm making noise. When across the board we see that our institutions and the literature and the research and our own data is supporting that our students are departing for these three reasons, how do we begin to change that conversation? The data we have. There are very few higher ed institutions, and particularly those that are public research institutions, that are not collecting loads of data. Good data, great data in many places. Sometimes I joke that we're collecting so much data, I think we collect shoe size, right? Because we collect everything. When did they go here? What did they do? What did they engage with? What did they touch? When did they do it? How many times did they do it? At what point did they do it, right? You can collect all the data in the world, but if you don't know the questions to ask, and if we're not putting analysis coupled with action around that data, you are simply collecting data. So as we move to how do we break down this work into academic units and to academic support units, there's kind of a cycle that I like to build around in doing this. You start at the top with what's called a common vision and understanding. And I would say that at some institutions, this in and of itself is a challenge. When you don't have a common vision and understanding of where you're going, what your goals are, everyone is out saying, okay, I'm trying to do this. Here at the University of Kansas, you have that common vision and understanding. You have targets that have been placed around where you want to be with graduation and retention. And they're clear. Having part of that vision and understanding, if it's just a number, is only the beginning. There's a reality of what does that mean? To move graduation rates to the level where you want to go and want to be, what does that really mean for the work that you're doing? How many more actual students is that have to come through our doors and be successful in each of our academic units? What do my numbers look like? What is going on in our space so that we understand who we are as a part of that larger vision? Those numbers can look large and looming when there's a distance for where you are now. And as one individual academic unit, your question goes to, so how do we even contribute? Or will it even matter what we're doing? That's where we move from, if we start with a common vision and understanding, we then have to begin to disaggregate and disaggregate the data. A lot of times, we sometimes think about this in trend data. Are we going up? Are we on a steady upward trajectory? Trends don't tell us much in this space. When you look at graduation rates, when you look at retention rates, typically they bump along, a little up, a little down across a period of time. There's a reality, though, of when you begin to disaggregate the data and to really see what is driving that rate, you can begin to do real work. I'll give you an example. If you look at your current data here at the University of Kansas, and you look at the retention rates and the graduation rates, and you look across time, if you were to disaggregate that solely at the institutional level by gender, you will see that during the first and second years, students by gender, male and female, are within 1 to 2 percentage points of each other. But when you move past that second year and you start looking at the third year, going into the fourth year, you begin to see that your men on the campus are sliding down a bit from your women. And that gap continues to grow all the way to their 6-year graduation rate. Something is going on with upper division men that has created a gap that wasn't initially there. That's at that campus level. At the academic unit level, there's no reason that the data can't be disaggregated in similar ways. That you can take apart and say, what does gender, ethnicity, Pell status, when a student declares our major, at what point in their career, right? How do these things affect a student's progress to degree, completion of degree in our particular program or overall to the institution? And what does that tell us about who our students are and the way that they're moving? If you flip and move to, say, if you're an academic support unit and not a solely academic unit, advising, for instance, you still disaggregate the data for the students you're working with. But you also look at the various programs and who those targets are. The one thing that I have to say that is very clear about this work is that we call it messy because there's no other way to describe it. You have to get down in the weeds and figure out what's going on, but you have to be able to bring it back up to the 30,000-foot level to understand how it is connected to the rest of the institution and all that we do and all that we provide. But when we get down in those weeds and begin to disaggregate our data, irrespective of the type of unit that we are, it gives us insight. Insight then leads to action. That action is something in which when you are looking for what are some of those indicators, what are some of those things that are triggers that's giving me insight, if we solely look at graduation rates or retention rates, those are called lagging indicators because you do them a year out. It has to be done and over with before you even know if you've had any movement. But the key here is with that insight, we are looking for leading indicators. And with those leading indicators, and there's a lot of work, again, I go back to the research, by Ed Truss, who's done a lot of work around those leading indicators. Now, nationally, the data will say leading indicators include things like taking English and math during your first 24 credit hours, declaring your major by a certain credit hour point, things of that nature, right? But for an institution, you got to drill down into your own data. What are your indicators that you can see as clear milestones and breakpoints that if a student does A versus B, it decreases their probability for graduation? I know that at this institution that there has been an investment in tools that help identify that type of information by academic unit, by population, across time, in a predictive modeling way. But how do we identify things that we can take action on halfway through the semester, at the end of the semester versus at the end of the year? At a certain milestone point that may not be time, but may be credit hour accumulation or engagement with certain types of activities. One of the things that we know for students, particularly our students where we see achievement gaps and persistence in graduation, like students who come from underrepresented backgrounds and students coming from low-income backgrounds, their engagement in student activities has a direct effect on their success. But more pointedly, what we have found is not just any engagement, particularly engagement in things like high-impact practices, overseas study, undergraduate research, service learning. These things and types of experience have a real impact on all students' success. But the research shows us across the nation that it has a higher impact on the success of students who are coming from under-resourced backgrounds into higher education. So I ask the question, I don't know at your institution, but at my institution, I don't know that I can say we know very clearly who is using our high-impact practices. And are we intentional about ensuring that a depth and breadth of students are using these types of practices that we know have real impact on their success? Is there a thought and a strategy and an intentionality in linking certain aspects that we know are indicators, predictors of our students being successful in ways that help us decrease the achievement gap in persistence and graduation across population? I bring up the gaps because what we also find in doing this work, if you approach it in a way in which you're simply saying, we're going to increase everything across the institution and our retention rates are going to go up. If it was that easy, every institution in the country would be doing it. And the reason that that doesn't always work is that when you simply do blanket improvements, students who know how to engage and who navigate well and have the academic preparation continue to go up, and those that do not continue to go down, and your gap simply becomes bigger. The key and where we have seen particularly public research institutions have an impact and literally have jumps in their graduation rates by 7, 8, even 10% is where they eliminate gaps between populations. So men and women are graduating at about the same rate. Students coming from underrepresented backgrounds or from low-income backgrounds are graduating on or about or above the rate of the overall student population. When you use your data and you identify leading indicators, and you can begin to decrease those gaps, you see real movement in your retention, persistence, and graduation rates. As I complete this circle, it is key and critical that we think about the resources and tools. I was in a conversation earlier today, and we were actually talking about assessment, learning outcomes in general. And I think it applies to a number of areas across higher ed. Sometimes we walk into conversations, and because we're all in higher ed and we understand that student success is important and that we need to increase our retention rate and that persistence matters and that completion is our goal and we need to have impact. And here's your data, and I need these numbers to move. And there is an assumption that who we have handed that to in our academic units, our academic support services, knows how to make it move. It is critical as we think about doing this work, particularly at the academic unit and academic support services level, that we are providing the resources and tools and models of excellence and impact that actually can have and see gains and improvements. Now, that doesn't mean going to Arizona or Georgia or Florida or any other institution and saying, okay. It's not about taking a model from another institution and simply saying it worked there, so it's going to work here, right? Because what they learned about their population to build the model is why they had the impact. But understanding what are the base tools, what data do we have available, what can we run, what resources do we have to target individual areas that we have identified as an issue. I will tell you, an institution like the University of Kansas has a plethora of resources that are in and around and supporting students in their success. But sometimes we have to connect the dots, and sometimes we don't tell our story well enough that others across the institution even know that we are doing that type of work that can help in the work that they are trying to accomplish as well. So building that network of resources and tools and models and partnerships and actually being intentional about saying, here it is, we don't expect you as an academic unit to understand how to fix it just because you should know this. It is going to take a partnership, it is going to take models, it is going to take a lot of coordination and collaboration to make this effective, and the tools and resources are here to support that effort. I would say lastly, as with anything of this nature, monitoring, evaluating, and readjusting is critical. That assessment, understanding, are we really having an impact? And this goes back to being messy, because when you start to do work in the student success space, it is really hard sometimes to say, we put in this program or this initiative or this technology, and that equated to 0.3 retention growth. If we could do that, again, everybody would be doing it, or we'd be marketing it somewhere to another institution, right? But there is real power in trying to ensure that we are able to monitor, evaluate, and then readjust where needed and necessary as we're moving along this continuum. We won't get it right the first time. We can't get it right the first time. It's just that difficult. We're going to get parts and pieces of it right? But we got to figure out which parts and pieces are right and which ones are not meeting the goals of our students and our overall institutional goals, so that those can be tweaked so we can get more of it right the second time and more of it right the third time. Because every time we get more and more and more of it right, that's 5 more students, that's 10 more students, that's 15 more students that are having a stronger experience, that are having continued success, that are graduating and completing. And then, as you see, the arrow goes back to that vision and that understanding. Because as we do this in our academic units, and we continue to grow and refine and do this work, we have to go back to what our goal is. We have to understand and see, are we working towards that goal, or have our goals slightly changed? Because this is ever evolving. And if we think that it's something that's fixed and that won't change, or that this is the number or this is the target, and we are rushing towards that, then what happens? Until we are at 100, that means every single day, every single year, we are still losing a student. So irrespective of what a target may be or a goal may be, as academic units, as academic support services, and as an institution as a whole, we have to keep redefining and refining what that target is, what that vision is, and what success has to look like for our students to be successful and for us to deliver on that brand promise that we make to them and their families. Thank you. I have time for questions, and I want to be mindful. I'm not ignoring that side of the room, but when I step this way, I get a weird feedback. So, but questions? Thank you. Yes, sir.
How do you plan to engage with faculty?
Thank you. The question is, how do you plan to engage with faculty? Faculty are critical in the work of student success, but overall in the nature of this office, the Office of Undergraduate Studies, there are three kind of main buckets of the work that I would say if you broke it down, and one of them is what this talk was about in terms of the pure like persistence and retention focus, and the other is also around curricular issues, particularly with the core, and then the third is the work of undergraduate studies in the various offices that are a part of that. Across all three of those spaces, faculty are critical and at the core of the work that is done. When you look at persistence work and you look at students who are successful, some of the key factors that we find is that students' engagement with faculty, both inside and outside of the classroom, is one of the strongest indicator of their success and their predictability. So part of that relationship with faculty is, are we capitalizing on that? Are we, how do we strengthen that relationship? How do we strengthen the resources and the tools for faculty for that engagement that fosters student success? And that doesn't necessarily mean programs or initiative. Stronger and more resources around teaching and learning and opportunities for mentorship, opportunities for undergraduate research, opportunities for just pure and natural engagement with faculty and being able to increase that helps all of our students, right? You got to put some intentionality around it. You got to put some support around that. But sometimes we're not even telling that message or even sitting at the table with our faculty partners to always have that conversation, and some of it has to start there, particularly in the academic units. What are academic units doing that is successful for their students? How can we get more students into one academic unit or another? That hinges on faculty, what faculty are doing, what faculty are teaching, how faculty are engaging, right? One of the things that you hear a lot is people talk about mentoring programs. You know, oh, we should put up a mentoring program. And a lot of places have great mentoring programs where you identify a student and you identify, you know, groups of students and you match them, whether it's big groups or one-on-one or what have you. The research shows that mentoring is a great kind of program in nature, particularly peer-to-peer. But the greatest impact that you find in mentoring when it comes to student success, and particularly with students who come from under-resourced backgrounds, is when that mentoring happens with the faculty member in a genuinely authentic engagement. That faculty member becomes a mentor, not because they were a part of a mentoring program, but because that student sees this individual as a mentor because of that authentic engagement. How do we take resources and an intentionality to ensure that our faculty are able to and have the ability to, the resources to, and the encouragement to have and be a part of that authentic engagement for our students. And that's where, for me, a lot of my work would start. Other questions? I'm going to go here and then there. Yes, ma'am.
So can you give us an example or two of some of the resources and tools that you might consider that would help you close this loop a little bit?
So the question is around an example of resources and tools that you could consider to close the loop, right? I'll give you a concrete example of some of the work that we're doing right now. I'm working at my home institution with a unit that works with students who are undeclared, right? So the students come into us, their first time college, and they're undeclared. In working with that unit, their perception of what some of the issues were with their students and where we needed to begin the work, we found didn't quite align. So they knew that they had students who weren't declaring their major till too late. That's one pocket. They also felt that they had students that were not taking their math and English before they hit 45 credit hours, which was critical in delaying their access into other things. Then they felt that they had a third pocket of student that was kind of hedging their bets, going over the 60 credit hour limit because they were trying to get certain GPAs to get into competitive majors. But we have other policies that then put other restrictions around that student who's accumulated so many credit hours, right? This is what they, as we started to disaggregate their data, this is what their initial perceptions were. So they came in with goals of fixing things in these three areas. We began to disaggregate their data. We began to identify some of the indicators. And what we found with the tools that had predictive analytics with it, which is one of the tools that we offered to them, we did it in partnership because our advisors do not have the time to sit in a data analytic tool and pull it apart and figure out what's going on. But in listening to the work that they were doing and what they believe were the issues, we took the tool, and for the tool that we use is a tool that you all have here on campus. It's Education Advisory Board's Student Success Collaborative. It has a predictive analytics for student success module that is at the core of what it is. And with that, we were able to both look at their predictability of when students needed to take their math and English, run that against the students that were currently at the institution, and actually pull a real concrete list. When we pulled that list, we found only 17 students hadn't had math, and only about 43 hadn't had English. But the perception of the advisors, just because when they see that student, it's such a difficult case, was that they had 200 or 300. When we moved into the space of the students who were declaring their majors late, we used both that tool and an institutional research tool that we had to look at time to degree and major switching patterns to see how many times a student switched major and how that extended their time to degree, and depending on when they declared that major, what the issue was. We then also worked with the Career Center that was doing some major exploration work, but that this office wasn't quite connected and linked into, which you would think that they would be, but sometimes that happens because we're doing our work and just trying to do our day-to-day. In doing that, we were able to identify, in this instance, with the predictability model and the data that we have, almost 300 students that fell into this category of when they were kind of on trajectory to declare their major, would put them at a point that it's almost too late, or that it decreased their probability for actual completion, right? And or increase their time to graduation. So we then tried to bring various offices together to help, what I would call, incentivize the work. To say, okay, how can we get the exploration, major exploration that's going on through our Career Center? How can we get our undeclared, undecided unit? How can we get a few other units, which are key transfers into a room? And what resources do we need to build a more intentional model of moving the students through? Part of that identified policies that we had to tackle, which then brought together a different group. Others identified simply, are there different advising things that we need to make available? We then ended up putting a set of resources together to help build a more exploration-friendly majors website, which was one of their outcomes, among other things, right? sometimes when we talk about tools, they are actual like technologies like a Starfish or a Student Success Collaborative or your own institutional research. Sometimes when we talk about resources, it's not purely money. Sometimes it's people's time or kind of leveraging or incentivizing certain type of work and getting all the right people in the room. But those models of how to do it, I think, are at the core of this work, in that that office was so energized around trying to help their students get to that point of declaring majors, but they didn't quite know how to put, kind of how do we actually turn the knob, right? Because what we're doing is having some impact, but not the impact we want. And sometimes it's about coupling resources or leveraging resources from an office like in undergraduate studies into that individual situation, so that that intervention, which we know has a larger impact when those students move into other majors, really is powerful. So there was a question over here.
Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy about how these things work. So there is a vice provost of student success. There's the vice provost of undergraduate studies. So I want to ask you what you think is the relationship between those two, and how this position is distinguished from the student success position.
Actually, it's student affairs,
Student affairs. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, it changed its name.
and undergraduate studies is academic,
Okay.
and student affairs is much more student life, co-curricular type things. But how would you?
I'm sorry.
Oh, no
would
problem.
you disaggregate?
So the question around student affairs and undergraduate studies. And as was kind of explained, typically the undergraduate studies is more the academic curricular, and the student affairs is student life and much more of the social integration part of it. But depending on the institution that you come from or the institution that you're at, you can see different models and you can see different units within each of those that literally could move back and forth. For instance, here at the University of Kansas, your first year experience sits in undergraduate studies, where at my home institution, some of the pieces that are in first year experience actually are in student affairs, and then some of them are in undergraduate studies. The key there is that if we move beyond the distinction of those offices and think about the work that we do from how a student moves through our institution, and the partnerships are built for that work in the proper way, we can have real impact on student success. And so sometimes some of our challenges is that a particular program does fall into one unit versus another, so that's their purview, so we're not going to work with it, or that's not our responsibility. But when you do this student success work, those boundaries, many of them have to go away, because there's very little work you can do in this space in one academic unit or in one division of the institution. You literally are going to need partners across. To give you an example, we did some work with our transfer student experience last year. And in doing so, we found one of the biggest concerns for our transfer was that academic integration into the institution. Right? And so making sure that they can move into the major, that they have the proper advising, that was critical to their success. And it was very impactful. But there were other things that also built around that. We hadn't had the ability to offer them housing, university housing. And so that was something that many of the students felt was a critical part of their integration into the institution, particularly because our housing has things like learning communities and other opportunities for them to access when they're a part of a learning community. On top of that, we identified with our financial aid process that we were processing later in the year, which had a real impact on those transfer students. And that if we could move that up a couple of months, it could be very impactful. We also then thought about orientation. Well, our students are registering and going through orientation in the summer as a transfer student that actually needs access to upper division courses that are actually available in the spring, and their registration would be better centered if they had an earlier registration period as a transfer student. To do all of that work, we had to have every division I could think of in a room, right? I mean, we had people from enrollment management, we had people from student affairs, we had people from undergraduate studies. And then once we got that foundation, we then had to have spin-off groups, because once we started getting into the academic parts of it, there was a piece that we had to work with our undergraduate deans on to really say, okay, this is some of what we're seeing in terms of the students' transition. Are there real barriers, or are there policies that we've put in place that are creating these barriers for those students? That then rolled down to, and some of the things that came out of that conversation pushed us to the academic advisors. So we had to get a group of academic advisors that work with transfers together to say, okay, now when does this need to happen, and how do we need to get them into their classes, and when do we need the appointments to open, and what makes sense in terms of their orientation. Not one office could have accomplished all that we did in 1 year to change the transfer student experience, right? Not one office could have even, I don't even know, like forced the others because of their individual activity, right? And it's important that that's not what's going on. It is critical that those offices understand that that structure is for our administrative purposes. It makes sense for how we work. It is not necessarily how a student navigates the institution and is most successful. And if we build this work and all of that we do in this space around how a student navigates, how a student understands their success at the institution, and bring the appropriate units together, for many times, it doesn't matter if it's undergraduate students or student affairs. It matters if the student actually got the resource that they need. And if we take that approach, we can continue to have greater and more powerful impact on those numbers. I think I'm about out of time.
Okay.
Thank you so much.